Hello, you lovers of fine music. Welcome to Full Record Jacket with Phil and Ben. And it's a program with a difference because there's no Ben. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, he's getting better. You may remember I told you a couple of weeks ago that he did have a touch of the old vertigo, which is really not very nice. I've never actually had it, but it sounds pretty awful, but he is on the mend. He's going to be back very soon. But in the meantime, he did ask me to do a monologue. And this is where it's just me talking and no comedic interjections from Ben, just me being a boring geek, basically. So that's what I've got for you. Sorry about that. But if you want to join me for this, then carry on listening because I'm just going to ramble on my own. And for this particular edition, I thought I'd talk about two bands. I put them together in the same program, and it's kind of unusual because these are very different bands and they had, in many ways, different audiences. But I have been listening to a little bit of both recently, and I just thought I'd do this for no other reason than, the title of this show might stir a few people and get a few people riled up when I put Guns N' Roses versus the Stone Roses. Now, what have these bands got in common? Because I did actually find a number of parallels between these two very different groups, bizarrely enough. And, apart from the fact that, of course, they both got roses in the title, that's kind of one of the reasons. But yes, we are talking about Guns N' Roses and the Stone Roses. So we have, let's just have a quick recap. There we have the Stone Roses from Manchester, one of the iconic British indie guitar bands of their era. And then, of course, Guns N' Roses, the LA hard rockers who really epitomized hard rock and, maybe heavy metal. I don't really think they're heavy metal, but they were lumped in with that scene in the late 80s and early 90s. So what parallels have I found between the two? Well, first of all, they both are very strongly associated with their home cities. The Stone Roses are from Manchester, or Madchester, as it was known in the late 80s. And the thing about them is that they were a guitar band, but they came out of a scene in Manchester where it wasn't just guitar music that was going on at that time. This was the era of acid house, and there was a legendary nightclub in Manchester called the Hacienda where people went and took various substances and danced the night away to all kinds of electronic dance music. And this had an influence on the Stone Roses. So there was a key difference between them and the guitar groups that had preceded them on the British indie scene, because they did bring some of that influence into their music, particularly on tracks like Fool's Gold, which is very funky and it's got that whole vibe. So you can't really have the Stone Roses without them being connected to Manchester. So a very strong connection there to their home city. And that's the same with Guns N' Roses, because they epitomize the hard rock that came out of Los Angeles in the mid to late 80s. I think, though, there was something about Guns N' Roses that was different. They did revitalize that scene. And the LA scene in the mid 80s, there were bands like, I'm trying to think of some of them now, Poison and Motley Crue. And I think Warrant, were they from LA? But they were certainly that kind of band. And there was what was really tended to get known as hair metal in the mid 80s. And the bands became more commercial, I think. And they also became a bit more outlandish in the way they dressed, and it got to the point where these weren't just long-haired rock bands. These were bands who were having their hair permed. They were doing all sorts of stuff that I just can't do anymore. But that was the kind of thing, and it got to the point of where it was becoming perhaps a little bit cliched and a little bit so I say commercialized, and it kind of lost its hard rocking edge. And Guns N' Roses came along and revitalized it really, because they really did rock hard and they really did have a very bad attitude. And there was something about them. They had a punk influence as well, and they just sort of really did kick American rock back into life at that point. But it very much came from the streets of LA. Or in the case of Axl Rose, actually, I think he was actually from Indiana. I think Axl Rose and Izzy Stradlin, the rhythm guitarist, were both from Indiana, but they went to LA to join a band. And Guns N' Roses are so called because, if I get this right now, I didn't do all the deep research on this, but there were two bands on the LA scene. One was called LA Guns, and the other was called Hollywood Rose. And I can't remember which one Axl Rose and Slash were in now. I can't even remember whether they were in the same band originally. But both those two bands kind of split up, and members from both, some of the members of each, got together and formed a new band, and hence the name Guns and Roses. So Guns N' Roses, the Stone Roses, very associated with their home cities. Now, both these bands became really, really iconic. And I think it's important to remember in the late 80s, early 90s, music was really quite tribal, certainly in Britain. If you were a fan of independent label guitar bands, chances are you were probably more likely to be a university student, or you were just into that kind of thing. And you probably weren't so much into mainstream pop, and you weren't really into hard rock or heavy metal. That was a different tribe. So the people that were into hard rock and heavy metal, their festival was Donington in the English Midlands. There was a festival there called the Monsters of Rock, and all those big heavy bands like Metallica and Iron Maiden, etc., they all performed at that festival. And if you were into indie guitar pop, then the key festival was probably Glastonbury, and that would have been the natural home for a band like the Stone Roses, although I don't think they actually played Glastonbury in their early years. But so both very much appealing to a particular tribe of fans. And both these bands became really the leading group for their particular tribe. Guns N' Roses became the defining American hard rock band in the late 80s, and the Stone Roses became the definitive British indie guitar band around that same time. And the other thing that I found as a parallel is that both these bands had really highly acclaimed debut albums. Now, the first album by Guns N' Roses, it came out first, so I'll talk about that first. It came out in 1987, and that was Appetite for Destruction. 12 songs, and the band really did have an appetite for destruction. If you listen to the album, and I introduced it to a friend, a musician friend who's younger than me, not long ago, and he was quite impressed by the playing on the album. And in fact, he liked it more than he thought he was going to. But still a really exciting album if you're prepared to go with the fact that there's a lot of mindlessly sexist and violent, well, not so much violent, but just mindlessly hedonistic songs about women and drugs, basically. But if you like hard rock, it's one of those albums that really does define it. And it became really much an album that so many bought. I think it sold 20 million copies in America or something like that. It was absolutely huge, and it was a huge album. Same with the Stone Roses within their field. They didn't obviously sell as many albums as that because they were an independent label band. Guns N' Roses were on Geffen Records, which is another parallel because the Stone Roses ended up on Geffen Records a little bit later on. But in their early years, the Stone Roses were on Silvertone Records, a British independent label. And their debut album, The Stone Roses, came out in 1989. And very similar story to Guns N' Roses in a way, because the album was out for about a year before it really started to take off. The Guns N' Roses album didn't really get big until it had been out for about 12 months. And that was pretty much the same, I think, with the Stone Roses debut album. But by 1990, the Stone Roses had become iconic in their field. And the album was, again, it's one of those sort of generational defining albums. These were not almost, they weren't just albums, they were almost religious artifacts if you were into those bands and that particular scene of either band. So acclaimed debut albums, legendary debut albums, which people still hold dear to this day. Another parallel between Guns N' Roses and the Stone Roses. And another parallel that is a pretty obvious one is that both bands contain undisputed guitar heroes within their field. Slash from Guns N' Roses, one of the great hard rock guitar players. I think when I think of hard rock guitarists who play a Gibson Les Paul guitar as their primary instrument, I'm thinking it's either Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin or it's Slash from Guns N' Roses. And of course, Slash does have the top hat, which helps with the iconic thing as well. But certainly a massively, massively acclaimed guitarist. I'm not really a proper guitarist, and I can only play a few little things that I learn from time to time. But so I'm in no position to talk about just how great these guys are. But it's undeniable that they clearly are very, very good at the top of their game. And their guitar playing is very, very listenable. You can listen to a Guns N' Roses album and just enjoy Slash's guitar playing. And that's the same with the Stone Roses. You can listen to them and just listen to John Squire's guitar playing. Very different style, but still great. And of course, John Squire has gone on and done other projects and performed on stage with many other bands and artists, just as Slash has done. So definitely a guitar hero in each of these bands. And in fact, really acclaimed musicians all round. Rennie in the Stone Roses, the drummer, Alan Wren, is regarded as integral to the band. He provided the beats and helped give them their funky sound and their dance influenced sound. Guns N' Roses, a little bit different with the drummer because they changed the drummer after the first album, but Steven Adler, the original drummer, may not have been technically the best, but people think he swings really well. And then you've got the bass players, Duff McKagan in Guns N' Roses and Marnie in the Stone Roses. Again, there's a bit of a parallel with these two guys, actually, because they're both seen as being amongst the most approachable characters in each band. And they've both been influenced by punk. Marnie was a fan of The Damned, apparently. And also Duff McKagan, the bass player in Guns N' Roses, was a fan of The Damned. In fact, Guns N' Roses did a cover version of New Rose. So there's another parallel. Of course, I've got to talk about the guys that front the bands. And I think it's fair to say that both lead singers are iconic. Certainly, Axl Rose is a rock icon. And both of these singers have voices that, they kind of love or hate, really. Axl Rose, depending on which side of the argument you're on, is either one of the great rock vocalists of all time, or he sounds like a strangulated cat crossed with someone pulling their fingernails down a blackboard. So you can decide whether you like him or not. But for those who do, he's definitely got a huge vocal range, huge charisma on stage. I think for me with Axl Rose, I do give him a bit of a free pass with some of the bad behaviour that he did, because he did do some pretty outrageous things. And certainly a controversial character. But when you look into his past life, and particularly his childhood, he did experience some really, really horrendous abuse from a very, very young age, mainly at the hands of his stepfather, his mother's partner, who not only abused him, but also Axl grew up seeing his sister and his mother very, very badly, violently and sexually abused. So it's not surprising that he turned out to be let's say, and not exactly a calm and reasonable character. Certainly during those early years, he may have calmed down a bit now, but yeah, I mean, this is a guy who once jumped off stage into the audience to punch a guy who was taking unauthorized photographs at a gig, and many, many other controversial and crazy episodes. Ian Brown of the Stone Roses, not as controversial as that, but a bit of a character. And again, maybe an acquired taste vocally, very different kind of vocalist. Singing more in a low register a lot of the time, and he's got that sort of almost a bit of a. How would you describe Ian Brown singing? He's sort of that sort of bit of attitude, but kind of a bit more low key. I think Ian Brown really was in many ways a template for Liam Gallagher of Oasis, but he was a bit more toned down. He's not so perhaps so in your face as Liam Gallagher. Not necessarily a great singer in the singer sense, but a good vocalist for that band and for the kind of music that they did. And it wouldn't be the Stone Roses without Ian Brown, and it wouldn't be Guns N' Roses without Axl Rose. So definitely iconic frontmen in both bands. Now, another thing that both these groups did in the early 90s is they gave their fans a very long wait. Now, I know which one shall I talk about first? Well, I'll talk about the Stone Roses because they, as I say, the debut album came out in 1989. It had become hugely popular in 1990. There was a couple of singles that came out in 1990 as well, and then nothing. They did a big gig. I think it was Spike Island, which I can't remember now. Is that in Cheshire or Merseyside? You'll have to let me know. I've forgotten. But that was a festival that was like, I suppose it was like the indie guitar Woodstock for that particular time period. And the Stone Roses headlined that. And I think that was the last gig they played for quite a few years. And they got involved in a big legal dispute with their record label, Silvertone. And so 1991, 1992, 1993, there was nothing from the Stone Roses. And the band became kind of as much of a myth as they were a band. They became, they were still legendary. They still had lots of fans. They just hadn't done anything for a while. So it was almost, like they were these untouchable, unseeable gods. And they didn't put out an album until I think it was right at the end of 1994. They put out the album The Second Coming, which got, there was obviously a lot of anticipation and a lot of hype around that album. So that was the long wait with the Stone Roses. With Guns N' Roses, there was an equally long wait, really. The debut album had come out in 1987, became big in 1988. There was a stopgap album in, I think it was 1989, called GNR Lies, which was basically a reissue of their first EP, and then 4 studio tracks added on to that, one of which was a remake of one of the songs on the first album. So it wasn't really a full album's worth of material. And Guns N' Roses were working on their follow-up album, which the project was called Use Your Illusion. And that eventually came out, maybe not quite such a long wait as the Stone Roses, but it felt like a long wait at the time. And it was September 1991 that they released the 2 double albums on the same day. I think a total of 30 songs, 30 tracks across these 2 double LPs or 2 full-length CDs. And again, of course, there was a lot of anticipation, a lot of hype around the albums. So that's another parallel between these bands. They both came back with massively, massively hyped albums, which at the time got mixed reviews, as I remember. And there's still a mixed view on these albums now. Now, I personally do enjoy both these records. I do think that the Stone Roses' Second Coming was unfairly slagged off by a lot of people. And I'm also a bit of a fan of Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion, this massive opus. I've always enjoyed it, for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's certainly some, there's some bizarre moments on that album, but there's certainly some great music on there as well. And yeah, another parallel between the band. And I guess the other thing that you could say about these two albums is that both bands, when they came back with these hyped albums, were both, I don't know whether it was an accusation, but I think it was a comment that was made about them both, is that they'd kind of gone more towards classic rock. The Stone Roses' Second Coming is definitely more of a bluesy influenced album. There's definitely guitar playing on there by John Squire, which seems to be more informed by classic rock guitarists like Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck, those kind of bluesy influenced guys. There's more of that on the Stone Roses' Second Coming. And on Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion, particularly with the influence of Izzy Stradlin, who left the band right after those albums were released, but he had a bit more of a Stonesy, rock and roll, Keith Richards kind of thing going on. And he definitely informed a lot of the songs on that album. And also with Guns N' Roses, with those Use Your Illusion albums, there was also more of a wider influence from Axl Rose's fandom of Elton John, for example, on the big ballad November Rain and that kind of thing. So both bands were slightly accused of going a bit more towards dad rock and music that was perhaps not seen as being quite as cool. Guns N' Roses came from more of a punky background, and they'd gone towards, the sort of classic rock. And the Stone Roses came from an indie pop, indie guitar background, and went a bit more towards the classic rock. So those are the parallels that I can think of between Guns N' Roses and the Stone Roses. My question now, of course, is which band do you prefer? Now, I know for many people, this is going to be a very, very easy answer. A lot of people are going to be absolutely one way or the other. But there's some of us out there that are going to have to think about this a little bit more. If you're going to a desert island and you're never going to be able to hear one of these bands again, but you're going to be able to take the catalogue of either Guns N' Roses or the Stone Roses, which one is it going to be and why? I will leave you to ponder that question. Let us know in the comments below. And in the meantime, let's all send our good wishes to Ben. He's going to be back. I've got a feeling he's going to go Stone Roses on this, but he may surprise us. But until the next episode, thanks for watching. Thanks for your likes and shares. And do remember to subscribe if you've not subscribed to us before. Thank you very much. Bye for now.